Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. We're going to be digging into something today that I know is probably sitting on your kitchen table right now, maybe even with a few dog-eared pages. It's election season in California, which means it's time to tackle those infamous California propositions.
Ah, yes, the voter guide.
Yeah.
A beloved annual tradition for some and a source of, shall we say, mild anxiety for others. But that's why we're here, to break it all down.
Exactly. And we've got a bit of a doozy this year. Lots of big issues, lots of strong opinions. And of course, as always in California, no shortage of interesting characters.
Well, let's not bury the lead. Where do you want to jump in first?
How about we start with something that's, well, top of mind for a lot of Californians, especially if you've got kids or schools. Proposition 2, the school facilities bond. We're talking a hefty chunk of change here, a cool $10 billion to be exact.
And it's not just about aesthetics, is it? It gets to the heart of how we value public education in this state. The learning environments we create, or we fail to create, for our kids.
Right, because the reality is some of our schools are, well, let's just say they've seen better days.
Crumbling infrastructure is a polite way to put it. Leaky roofs, outdated electrical systems, you name it. The articles we reviewed cited a pretty startling statistic. Something like 38% of California schools don't even meet basic safety standards.
Which begs the question, how are kids supposed to focus on their ABCs when they're worried about the ceiling caving in?
Right. It's hard to argue with that. Safe and healthy learning environments should be a fundamental right, not a luxury. And that's the crux of the argument supporters are making.
But of course, there's always another side to the story. $10 billion. That's a lot of money, even for a state like California. So what are folks saying about the potential downsides?
Well, it's not necessarily that anyone's against fixing up our schools. It's more about, I think, the how and the why. Opponents, and you're going to hear this a lot with these propositions, they argue that this bond measure is just a Band-Aid solution, a temporary fix that doesn't address the underlying issue.
Which is?
Which is that California has a bit of a habit of relying on bonds to fund essential services instead of making those investments part of the regular budget.
So it's that classic debate between a quick fix and a systemic overhaul. And it makes you think about all the other pressing needs in our state that $10 billion could go towards.
Exactly. Affordable housing, healthcare, early childhood education, the list goes on.
Yeah.
And on.
Tough choices, for sure.
Tough choices indeed.
Well, speaking of tough choices, how about we move on to a topic that's been, well, hotly debated, to say the least. Same-sex marriage. Proposition 3. And I know what you might be thinking. Didn't we already deal with this, like, years ago? And the answer is, well, yes and no.
It's complicated. California has legally recognized same-sex marriage since 2013, thanks to that landmark Supreme Court ruling. But here's the thing. That old Proposition 8 from way back in 2008, the one that banned same-sex marriage, it's technically still lingering in the California Constitution.
Like a bad penny.
Exactly. And that's what Proposition 3 aims to do, finally get rid of that outdated language and enshrine marriage equality in the California Constitution once and for all.
So more of a symbolic victory than a practical change, since same-sex marriage is already legal here.
To some extent, yes. But supporters argue that it's about sending a clear message, particularly in this current political climate, where we're seeing, well, a rollback of rights in other parts of the country.
It's a way of California saying, we're not going back.
Exactly.
Makes sense. But not everyone sees it that way, right? What about the other side of the aisle? Why are some folks opposed to removing Proposition 8 from the Constitution?
Well, their argument boils down to this. The issue's been settled, the Supreme Court has spoken, no need to revisit it. Why bother with a symbolic gesture that doesn't actually change anything on the ground?
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because for some people, symbols matter. They represent something bigger than just the letter of the law.
They do. And this debate over Proposition 3 really highlights that tension, that ongoing conversation we have as a society about how we codify our values. Is it enough to simply have rights protected by the courts? Or do those rights need to be explicitly spelled out in our state's governing document?
Deep questions. All right, well, let's shift gears for a moment. From social issues to something that directly impacts, well, everyone's wallets. Proposition 32. The minimum wage increase.
Ah, yes, the perennial debate. How much should people at the bottom run of the economic ladder be paid? And in California, with our astronomical cost of living, well, that debate takes on a whole new level of urgency.
Absolutely. So, Proposition 32, it proposes raising the state minimum wage to $18 an hour. Phased in gradually, of course, by 2025. with a little extra time for small businesses to comply.
That's right. And after 2025, the minimum wage would then be adjusted annually based on inflation. So the idea is to ensure that it keeps pace with, well, the ever-increasing cost of living in this state.
And supporters argue that this is, well, essential for basic economic fairness.
Right. They point out that even in the most affordable parts of California, the current minimum wage, it just doesn't cut it. Not even close. Not when you factor in housing costs, groceries, transportation, childcare, all of it.
The articles we read mention that in some California counties, just to make ends meet, you'd need to be earning over $20 an hour.
Which makes you wonder, how are people even surviving on the current minimum wage? They're not. They're relying on public assistance, working multiple jobs, racking up debt. And this isn't just a moral issue, although it certainly is that. Supporters of Proposition 32, they argue that raising the minimum wage is good for the economy as a whole.
How so?
Well, more money in people's pockets means more spending at local businesses. It can lead to a decrease in reliance on social safety net programs. And ultimately, they argue, it creates a more equitable and just society.
Sounds like a win-win, but something tells me not everyone's on board with this.
You would be correct. As you can imagine, this one's facing some pushback, primarily from business groups. And their main argument is that, while well-intentioned, raising the minimum wage could actually end up backfiring, hurting the very people it's supposed to help.
How so?
They argue that forcing businesses to pay their employees more could lead to job losses, especially in industries where profit margins are already razor-thin.
So instead of helping low-wage workers, it could make it even harder for them to find jobs.
That's their concern. And they also worry about the impact on small businesses, which often operate on much tighter budgets than larger corporations.
It's a classic example of that age-old question, what's the role of government in regulating the economy?
Right. Is it the government's place to mandate a minimum wage? Or should we let the free market dictate wages? These are fundamental questions about how we structure our society, about fairness and equity, and the role of business in creating a just and prosperous world.
Big questions for sure. Big questions with no easy answers. Speaking of which, let's talk about something near and dear to, well, anyone who's tried to rent an apartment in California lately, the cost of housing. Or, more specifically, Proposition 33, the rent control expansion.
Ah, yes, rent control. It's one of those issues that tends to elicit very strong opinions on both sides. And for good reason. It gets at the heart of some fundamental questions about affordability, equity, and frankly, who gets to live in California.
Right, because California's housing crisis, it's no secret at this point. We talk about it, well, pretty much every other episode. And for renters, it can feel like a constant uphill battle just to keep a roof over their heads.
The statistics are pretty grim. In many parts of California, people are spending well over 50% of their income just on rent. It's unsustainable.
Absolutely. And it's not just a big city problem anymore. This is impacting communities across the state.
Small towns, rural areas, you name it, it's everywhere.
So to understand Proposition 33, we need to talk about this other thing called Costa-Hawkins, which sounds like, well, I don't know, a law firm or maybe a fancy brand of coffee.
It does have a ring to it, doesn't it? But it's actually a state law that's been around for a while. It limits the ability of cities to enact rent control measures.
So it's like even if a city wanted to put stricter rent control measures in place, their hands are tied by this Costa-Hawkins thing.
Precisely. And that's what Proposition 33 aims to change. It would give cities more leeway to basically have more control over their own housing markets. They could potentially limit how much landlords can raise rents, even for new tenants. And they could expand rent control to cover a wider range of housing types.
So it's about giving cities more tools to tackle this affordability crisis. More power to the local governments, you might say.
That's the idea. And supporters, they argue that this is absolutely crucial, especially now as more and more people are being priced out of their communities. It's about preserving the character of neighborhoods, preventing displacements, and ensuring that people who live and work in a community can actually afford to, continue living and working in that community.
Makes sense to me. But I'm guessing not everyone's thrilled about this idea. Landlords and real estate developers, I'm looking at you.
You know it. And they make some compelling counter-arguments. Their main point is that expanding rent control, while it sounds good on paper, could actually end up making the housing crisis worse.
How so?
Well, their argument goes like this. If you make it harder for landlords to make a profit, they're going to be less likely to build new housing. And if you don't have enough housing to meet demand, well, guess what happens? Prices go up, even higher. It's basic supply and demand.
So it's a classic example of a well-intentioned policy potentially having, yet again, those unintended consequences.
Exactly. It's complicated. There are valid arguments on both sides, and it really highlights just how complex and interconnected this issue of housing is. It's not just about rent control. It's about zoning laws. It's about incentives for developers. It's about transportation. Well, it's about everything.
It's about the American dream, right? Except somewhere along the way, that dream became, well, a lot harder to achieve for a lot of people.
Ain't that the truth?
All right, so let's move on to a proposition that feels, well, a little bit like an episode of Billions. This is where things get juicy. Proposition 34, the healthcare provider spending requirement.
This one's interesting because it seems, well, a little bit personal.
Like someone's got an axe to grind.
Maybe. It all revolves around this one particular organization, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, or AHF. Ever heard of it?
I can't say that I have. Enlighten me.
Well, they're a big player in the healthcare world, especially when it comes to HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment. But they've also become increasingly involved in, shall we say, other policy areas. Housing, in particular.
Okay.
And they've poured a lot of money into supporting stricter rent control measures, which, as we just discussed, has put them at odds with some pretty powerful interest groups.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Right. So, enter Proposition 34. This measure would impose strict limits on how much certain healthcare providers can spend on things besides direct patient care. We're talking about executive salaries, administrative overhead, lobbying efforts, that sort of thing.
Okay, so on the surface, that doesn't sound so unreasonable, right? I mean,
Yeah.
who wants their healthcare dollars going towards some CEO's bonus instead of, actual medical care?
Right, exactly. But here's where it gets a little, shall we say, targeted. The criteria laid out in the proposition, they just happen to perfectly describe one organization and one organization only.
You don't say. The AHF!
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
So it sounds like some folks are trying to use this proposition to basically punish the AHF for getting involved in the rent control debate.
That's one way to interpret it. And of
Yeah.
course, supporters of Proposition 34, they frame it a little differently. They say it's about transparency and accountability, making sure that healthcare dollars are being used for their intended purpose, which is, taking care of sick people, not lining the pockets of, well, you know who.
Right, but the AHF, I'm guessing they have a different take on this whole thing.
They do. They call it a blatant attack, pure and simple. And they argue that this is a dangerous precedent, trying to silence dissent by, well, essentially using the ballot box to target specific organizations.
It's like something out of House of Cards.
Right. It's a good reminder that behind all the policy jargon and legalese, there are real people with real agendas. And sometimes those agendas, well, they get a little messy.
It's all about power, isn't it? Who has it, who wants it, and who is willing to, shall we say, bend the rules to get it.
Politics 101, my friend.
All right, well, let's move on to a proposition that at first glance might seem a little less dramatic, but it has huge implications for millions of Californians. This is about healthcare, more specifically, how we pay for it. Proposition 35, dedicated medical funding.
This one's all about ensuring that a specific tax, the managed care organization tax, is used for its intended purpose,
Which is?
funding Medi-Cal, California's Medicaid program,
Yeah.
the one that provides health care to low-income residents.
Right, Medi-Cal. A lifeline for so many Californians.
Millions of them. Over a third of the state's population, in fact, rely on Medi-Cal for their health care.
So remind me how this managed care organization tax thing works again.
Sure. So basically, these managed care organizations, or MCOs, they're private insurance companies that contract with the state to provide healthcare services to people enrolled in Medi-Cal.
So they're like middlemen between the state and the patients.
Exactly. And this tax on MCOs is meant to help cover the costs of providing those services. So it's supposed to be a dedicated funding stream for Medi-Cal.
Okay, that makes sense. But it sounds like there's some disagreement about whether those funds are always being used as intended.
You got it. Proponents of Proposition 35, and this includes a lot of healthcare providers and patient advocacy groups, they argue that the state has a history of, shall we say, dipping into this dedicated tax fund to cover other budget shortfalls.
You mean like raiding the piggy bank?
Essentially. And that's a major problem because Medi-Cal, despite serving such a large portion of the state's population, is chronically underfunded. Meaning long wait times for appointments,
Yeah.
limited access to specialists, providers who are often reluctant to accept new medical patients because reimbursement rates are so low.
It's a mess.
It is. And that's exactly what Proposition 35 aims to address. It would mandate that this tax revenue be used solely for Medi-Cal, period. No more funny business.
Seems pretty straightforward. Protect healthcare for the most vulnerable. It's hard to argue with that. So, is anyone actually against this?
Well, there isn't any formal opposition to Proposition 35 listed in the voter guide. But it's worth noting that historically, some fiscal conservative groups, they're not always crazy about this kind of earmarking, dedicating specific funds for specific purposes.
Why not?
They'd argue that it ties the hands of lawmakers, limits their flexibility to allocate funds where they're most needed.
I guess there's a fine line between ensuring accountability and, well, micromanaging the budget.
There is. And it gets the heart of how we as a society decide to prioritize our spending. Where do our values lie? What are we willing to invest in? These are big questions, and unfortunately, there's no easy answers.
Just like with everything else we've talked about today. Well, speaking of tough questions, let's dive into something a little closer to, well, my heart. Criminal justice reform. It's an issue I care deeply about, and one that I think often gets, well, oversimplified.
It does. It's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric, the tough on crime versus leniency for criminals kind of debate. But the reality, as always, is much more nuanced.
Exactly. So let's talk about Proposition 36. It's a measure that's asking voters to, well, in a way, reconsider some of the changes made by a previous ballot measure.
Proposition 47, right? Passed
Yeah.
back in 2014.
That's the one. Now, for those who might not remember all the details of Proposition 47, can you give us a quick refresher?
Absolutely. So Proposition 47, it was a big deal at the time. It reclassified certain nonviolent felonies like shoplifting and drug possession as misdemeanors. And the goal really was twofold. First, to reduce California's prison population, which had become incredibly overcrowded and costly. And second, to shift resources away from incarceration and towards rehabilitation and treatment programs.
So less time behind bars, more focus on addressing the root causes of crime. Sounds like a good idea in theory. So what happened?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's where things get, well, a bit messy. Because while there's no doubt that Proposition 47 did succeed in shrinking the prison population, the debate about its overall impact, well, that's still raging on.
And that brings us to Proposition 36, the sequel.
Exactly. The sequel, or some might say the rebuttal. Because Proposition 36, it essentially wants to, well, pump the brakes on some of those changes made by Proposition 47.
So less leniency, harsher penalties.
That's the gist of it. Supporters of Proposition 36, and this includes law enforcement groups, some retailers, and victims' rights advocates, they argue that Proposition 47 swung the pendulum too far in the other direction. They say it's created a climate where criminals know they can basically get away with certain crimes without facing any real consequences. And they point to statistics showing an uptick in property crime, particularly shoplifting, as evidence that the system is broken.
They want to restore that sense of, well, I guess you could say law and order.
Exactly. Deterrence. Accountability. Those are the buzzwords you'll hear a lot from folks who support Proposition 36.
And what about the opposition? What are they saying?
Well, not surprisingly, many of the folks who supported Proposition 47 back in 2014, they're not too keen on this new measure. They see it as a step backward, a return to those tough-on-crime policies that led to mass incarceration in the first place.
They'd argue that instead of locking people up, we should be investing in things like mental health services, drug treatment programs, job training, all those things that can help break the cycle of crime.
That's right. And they often point out that these harsher sentencing laws, they tend to disproportionately impact communities of color, further exacerbating existing inequalities.
So it's a really complex issue with, you guessed it, no easy answers.
And it really gets at the heart of what we believe the purpose of the justice system should be. Is it about punishment? Is it about rehabilitation? Or is it about something else entirely? These are questions that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries, and unfortunately, they're not ones we're going to solve in this episode.
But hopefully we can at least encourage people to think critically about these issues, to look beyond the sound bites and the slogans, and really engage with the complexities of criminal justice reform. Because the stakes, they couldn't be higher.
That's right. We're talking about people's lives here, their freedom, their futures. It's not something to be taken lightly.
It's really striking how often we encounter this question of unintended consequences, like we saw with the minimum wage debate and now again with criminal justice reform. It makes you realize there are no easy answers, are there?
Not when it comes to these complex societal issues. There's always a ripple effect. What seems like a straightforward solution on the surface can have these, unforeseen consequences, and sometimes they don't even become apparent for years, even decades down the line.
Which leads us perfectly to Proposition 6. This one's really forcing California to confront, well, a pretty dark chapter in its past. We're talking about forced labor.
Yeah, it's a tough one for sure, especially for a state that, prides itself on being so progressive.
Right. Like when you hear the phrase forced labor, you don't exactly picture, sunny California. It brings to mind images of like, I don't know, chain gangs and prison plantations, stuff you'd read about in history books, not something you expect to find happening in the 21st century, right?
You'd be surprised. While, California has it's made some progress in reforming its criminal justice system, there's still a long way to go. And the use of involuntary prison labor, well, it's still very much a reality.
So fill me in. What's the deal with Proposition 6? What exactly is it trying to change?
So right now, California law actually allows for inmates to be required to work,
Yeah.
often for like very little pay or sometimes even no pay at all.
And Proposition 6 would basically make that illegal.
Essentially, yeah. It would amend the California Constitution to specifically prohibit involuntary servitude and forced labor in prisons.
So it's not about, getting rid of prison work altogether. It's about giving inmates a choice, right?
Yeah.
Making sure they're not being exploited.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even within the confines of the prison system, people still have basic human rights, dignity. They deserve to be treated with respect, not treated like slaves.
Right, absolutely. But I imagine there are some concerns about the practical implications of this. I mean, what happens if inmates just decide they don't want to work?
Right. That's one of the main concerns that opponents have raised. They worry about the cost, for one thing. I mean, if you're going to be paying inmates a fair wage for their labor, that's going to require a significant investment from the state.
And the state budget, it's already stretched pretty thin as it is.
Exactly. And then there's the logistical challenges. If inmates can just refuse to work, could that create staffing shortages? Could it lead to safety issues within prisons? These are all valid questions that need to be carefully considered.
So it sounds like there's no easy solution here. Like so many of these other propositions we've been talking about, it's about finding that balance, right? In this case, the balance between human rights and fiscal responsibility and public safety.
Yeah. Exactly. It's complicated. But, even just having this conversation, it's important, right? Because it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our history, about our values, about how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society.
Absolutely. And speaking of uncomfortable truths, let's bring things back down to earth for a minute, literally.
Back down to earth. You're talking about property taxes.
Not quite, but close. I'm talking about Proposition 5. This one might seem a little dry, a little procedural at first glance, but it actually has the potential to significantly impact, well, how things get done right there in your own community.
Ah, right. The one about lowering the voting threshold for local bond measures.
That's the one. So, quick civics lesson here. Are you ready?
Hit me with it.
Okay, so right now, if your city or county wants to borrow money for, let's say, a big project, we're talking about new schools, parks, roads, you name it, they often have to get voter approval for that, right? And to do that, they issue something called a bond measure.
Right, like a loan that they pay back over time with interest.
Exactly. And under current California law, in order to pass a bond measure, they need a supermajority vote.
Which is how much again? I can never remember.
2/3. Which is, let's be honest, a pretty high bar to clear.
It is, especially in this day and age when it seems like getting people to agree on anything is practically a miracle.
Right. So enter Proposition 5. This measure would lower that threshold from a 2/3 supermajority to a simple majority, 55%.
So a much lower bar to clear, which I imagine is exactly what supporters are hoping for.
Right. They argue that this change would make it easier for communities to fund essential projects, like those schools and parks and roads we were just talking about,
Yeah.
especially in areas where it's been really difficult to get that supermajority vote.
Makes sense. But I bet opponents have some concerns about this. I mean, lowering the voting threshold, it's bound to make some people nervous.
Oh, absolutely. And those concerns usually revolve around, fiscal responsibility, accountability.
Meaning, they're worried that if you make it easier to pass these bond measures, it could lead to, well, more government spending. And more government spending could lead to higher taxes.
Right. That's their argument. They say that the current two-thirds supermajority requirement, it's there for a reason. It's a safeguard against reckless borrowing. It ensures that there's broad community support for these big projects that, that could have long-term financial implications.
Right. I mean, it's like the difference between needing a simple majority vote to, I don't know, to repaint your living room versus needing a supermajority to take out, like, a second mortgage on your house.
Right. One decision carries a lot more weight than the other.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
with Proposition 5, it really comes down to how much risk are we willing to tolerate?
Right, because there's always a trade-off, isn't there?
Always.
Now, here's where things get a little house of cards, shall we say.
Oh, I love a good political thriller.
Yeah.
What's the backstory here?
Well, so as you know, the California Association of Realtors, they're a pretty powerful force in state politics.
To put it mildly.
Right. And they've been very vocal about their support for lowering the voting threshold for local bonds, especially when it comes to funding infrastructure projects.
Which makes sense, right? I mean, better roads, better schools, all of that, it tends to boost property values.
Exactly. And while they haven't officially endorsed Proposition 5, there's a lot of speculation that they played shall we say, a behind-the-scenes role in getting this measure on the ballot.
Interesting. So it's a classic case of, follow the money.
Always. It's a good reminder that even these seemingly boring, procedural issues, they often have these fascinating backstories.
And that there are always different agendas at play.
It's kind of wild when you think about it. All these different issues we've been talking about, they might seem totally separate at first glance, but they're all connected in some way. It's like we've been saying this whole time. There's no such thing as a simple solution.
It's all part of this big, messy, complicated tapestry. Right?
Exactly. And sometimes those threads, they get all tangled up, and that's when you get those unintended consequences we were talking about earlier. It's enough to make your head spin.
Well, speaking of head spinning, I think we saved the biggest, or at least the most expensive, proposition for last.
Ah, yes, Proposition 4, the grand finale. This is the one that's asking voters to approve a cool, wait for it, $10 billion. That's billion with a B in bonds to address, well, what might be the biggest challenge facing California today?
The environment.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner. All right, so Proposition 4, the environmental and climate bond. Let's break it down. Where exactly is all that money going?
Well, the lion's share, about $3.8 billion, would be dedicated to water-related projects.
Which, given our state's history with, drought and flooding and all that, it's not exactly surprising, is it?
Not at all. We need water to survive, plain and simple.
Yeah.
And our current infrastructure, it's just not up to the task. Not with climate change making things even more unpredictable.
So these funds would be used for things like what? Upgrading our water storage systems, improving water quality.
All of the above, plus some. We're talking about a whole range of projects from restoring wetlands and watersheds to investing in new technologies to conserve water. It's about ensuring that we have enough clean, safe water for everyone, for generations to come.
Right, because it's not just about today, is it? It's about the future.
Exactly. But, Proposition 4, it's not just about water. It also includes a significant chunk of change for wildfire prevention and forest health.
Which, after the past few fire seasons we've had here in California, it's hard to overstate how important that is.
Yeah, those wildfires are getting more and more intense, more and more destructive every year. And, climate change, it's a huge part of that.
So what can we even do at this point? Is it too late?
Well, I wouldn't say it's too late. Not yet, anyway. But we got to act, and we got to act fast. And that's really what Proposition 4 is all about. It's about taking proactive steps to reduce the risk of these catastrophic wildfires. Things like clearing brush, creating defensible space around communities. But it's also about restoring those forests to a healthier state, making them more resilient to fire, to drought, to all of it.
Right, because healthy forests, they're better equipped to fight back, right?
Exactly. And, beyond water and wildfires, Proposition 4, it also includes funding for a whole bunch of other important environmental initiatives. Like, we're talking about protecting our coastlines from sea level rise, investing in renewable energy, cleaning up polluted land. It's pretty comprehensive.
It sounds like it. So, it's hard to argue with the goals here, right? Clean water, healthy forests, a cleaner environment. These are good things.
Right. But of course, there's always a but, isn't there?
Yeah.
And with a $10 billion price tag, well, there are bound to be some people who who might have some questions about whether this is the best way to spend that money.
Because even for a state as wealthy as California, $10 billion, that's still a lot of money.
It is. And that money, it has to come from somewhere. And while supporters of Proposition 4, they argue that the long-term benefits of these environmental investments, the jobs created, the money saved by preventing future disasters, they say it'll more than make up for the costs, but opponents, they might argue that, taking on this much debt, it could have negative consequences down the road, especially if the economy takes a downturn.
It's that classic dilemma, right? Short-term costs versus long-term benefits. And when it comes to the environment, the stakes, they just feel so much higher.
They do. Because we're not just talking about, balancing the budget here. We're talking about the health of our planet, the future of our species.
It's about our kids, our grandkids.
Exactly. And that's what makes these decisions so difficult, right? Because we're not just voting on policies, we're voting on values.
And those values, they're going to shape California for generations to come. Well, folks, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from crumbling schools to sky-high rents, from the complexities of criminal justice reform to the urgent need to address climate change. We've explored some pretty weighty issues.
We have. And we've only just scratched the surface.
Right, exactly. But hopefully we've given you, our listeners, some food for thought, some things to mull over as you make your way through that giant voter guide.
And don't forget your vote. It's your voice. It's your chance to shape the future of this state.
So get out there, make your voice heard, and as always, keep diving